The hardest game in the world is a title that is often discussed and contended both on and offline. Many people argue it belongs to one of the games in the Souls series for their brutal boss fights and the sheer expanse of the games themselves. Others will point to games such as Ghosts and Goblins or Battletoads, citing their extremely unforgiving nature and the near-perfect inputs they require. Others yet describe the painful experiences they had with brutalist platformers, think Celeste or Jump King, and the list goes on and on. Yet there is a game which I have scarcely heard brought up in this discussion, and one which I find to have a strong argument for the title. Released by IREM on April 28, 1889 for the Famicom home console, Holy Diver is an action platformer similar to Castlevania, the main difference being your arsenal of magic, which you gain as you beat the various stages throughout the game. For those unfamiliar with the Famicom, it was essentially the Japanese predecessor to the NES, with many of the games for the console getting adapted and released on the NES globally. Holy Diver, however, would not get a worldwide release until 30 years after its initial release. The reason for such falls on the word holy being against Nintendo's religious content policy. This would lead to the game being practically unknown in the Western world, with the exception of it being featured on Cosmic's NES Gauntlet and in the 2013 AGDQ. Now, to say this game is hard would be an understatement. To beat it, you must travel through 6 increasingly long, brutalist hellscapes, all while being bombarded by enemies. The levels are riddled with small ledges and large pits. There are completely unfair enemies and bosses, invincible death grapes, and frame-perfect jumps that are required to make progress in some areas. Everything about this game just forms into an amalgamation of pure difficulty, and this is true more so in one level than any of the others by orders of magnitude. A barrier that anyone crazy enough to brave this game finds themselves faced with, and one that drives madness deep into the player's soul. This is Holy Diver's 4th stage, the Golden Temple. The level begins with you having to traverse a wall of bricks whilst boulders charge towards your position from the right side of the screen. Now, your natural instinct upon seeing this barrier would be to jump up and progress forward into the level, but that turns out to be a really bad idea, because if you don't specifically wait for the boulders, you know, the ones that you haven't seen or know exist yet, to roll above you and allow you to destroy them, then you're gonna get hit. Twice. Well, okay, fine, you can get used to that, it's not like it's hard to do or anything, even if it is a lousy trap for players who are playing the level for the first time. Once you've gotten past that section, however, we get introduced to the first annoying enemy in the stage, gargoyles. The gargoyle's attack pattern consists of 2 separate phases. The first one, where the gargoyle positions itself slightly above and at a distance from the player while firing projectiles that arc downwards, and the second, in which it comes in close to the player and fires a single, larger projectile that deals twice as much damage as the previous ones. The first gargoyle here isn't really that much of a problem. As long as you stay on the pillar, you can simply keep shooting it with your base attack. And even if you get hit, you can just jump back up on the pillar and keep firing away until it dies. After that, simply jump down from the pillar and avoid some more falling boulders, and congratulations! You've made it through the first page in an anthology of suffering. Not so bad, huh? Well, don't worry. It's about to get much, much worse. But let's pause a second before getting into that. For the amount I hyped this level up, this beginning here seems quite disappointing, don't you think? Well, there's a reason for that. Notice how the level starts you off with a continuous, uninterrupted ground. No pits or precarious footholds. All you have to fear is damage. The true threat of this level presents itself at last. Take the floaty, unforgiving jump, Castlevania-esque knockback, and a stage centered around a lack of viable footholds, and what do you get? Hell. It's hell. You get hell. It's at this point Holy Diver takes a skill jump further than anything I've ever really experienced in gaming. Nothing but absolute precision will cut it going forward. That being said, there's only one way to go, so there's nothing to do but take the leap of faith, and make sure to land nice and center on the platform.
You triggered my trap card!
This guy is known as a larva. They were introduced in the previous level and spawn out of the ground in particular spots, always in groups of 3. Their attack pattern consists of jumping straight up in the air and firing a projectile at the player, before leaping to a new location and repeating the process. These guys weren't really all that much of a nuisance in Stage 3, as there was plenty of space to fight them, and mistakes in doing so were only lightly punished. However, in Stage 4, the larvae have moved into some precarious locations, where anything less than flawless handling of them can lead to death. What's essentially required where they appear in this manner is landing on the edge of the platform and spamming the B button as fast as you can while crouched. Now this sounds pretty simple, and as if not much could go wrong, but that's not necessarily the case. When dealing with the larvae in this position, they absolutely cannot be allowed to jump, as if they are, then they will begin to fire projectiles, and your position will be compromised, which in this case can mean pretty certain death. With that being said, the real difficulty in this section comes from the return of the gargoyles, as without any ground to land on when hit, they become much more of a threat than earlier. But before I get to that, I need to touch on the magic system in Holy Diver first. In addition to the standard projectile that the player fires, there are 5 spells that the player gains access to throughout the game. Pressing select enters the spellcasting mode, indicated by the player character turning blue. The first of these spells, which the player starts with and costs 2 MP, is Twin Fire. It's essentially an upgraded version of the standard projectile, instead firing 2 shots that spin around each other, dealing more damage and flying a further distance than the base spell. The second spell, unlocked by beating level 1 and costing 10 MP, is Blizzard. Blizzard is not a damaging spell, but instead freezes lava and weak enemies for a short period of time. The third spell, unlocked by beating level 2 and also costing 10 MP, is Breaker. Breaker is a high damaging projectile that starts as a concentrated ball of magic and then breaks apart, sending several powerful projectiles in the direction the player used it. The fourth spell, unlocked by beating level 3 and costing 16 MP, is Overdrive. Overdrive summons 2 mana blades that circle around the player for several seconds, damaging anything that comes into contact with them. The fifth spell, unlocked by beating level 4 and costing 20 MP, is Thunder. Thunder is the highest damaging spell in the game, and essentially just nukes everything on screen save for the bosses, but it won't find any use here for obvious reasons. With all that said, the best spell to use against the gargoyles here is Breaker, given it can kill them in a single use. Even then, the next few gargoyles leave absolutely no room for error. Waiting on the moving platform and allowing the gargoyle to spawn while you try to time your jump will result in death. Holding the A button too long and having too floaty of a jump will result in death. Even doing everything right and simply getting bad luck with where the gargoyle's projectile falls will result in death. Getting past the gargoyles in this section is a nightmare for players starting out, and can even trouble those who have mastered every aspect of the game's controls. Upon reaching the platform with breakable blocks, you'd be tempted to continue forth as you have been and jump down to the next foothold. However, that's a surefire way to get sent straight into oblivion. You see, not only is there a gargoyle present, but the platform we're meant to land on is infested with larvae. Trying to take out the gargoyle will only leave the larva primed to kill you, and vice versa. Luckily, it's possible to bait the gargoyle into spawning by jumping off the platform and returning, making him the easiest of them in a twist of fate. However, that leaves the larva who can still slip by your shots and knock you all the way back to the beginning if you're unlucky. If all of that wasn't enough, the next platform has 2 gargoyles at once, making it twice as likely for the player to be hit by an overzealous projectile. Additionally, if the player fails to hit between the 2 gargoyles and only kills one of them with their first shot, the time to deal with them doubles, furthering the likelihood of being hit and knocked to your death to an even higher degree. Past these gargoyles is the end of the pits on the screen, and the player can finally take a sigh of relief. The final part of this area consists of the boulders from earlier in the stage and 2 larva spawns. Attempting to deal with the larva here without taking loads of damage from the boulders is nigh impossible, as diverting any of your attention from either hazard will result in the other getting out of hand. The only reasonable way to move forward is to damage boost off of the larva and avoid being hit by the boulders on the way to them. The boost is somewhat precise, but essentially necessary given the alternative. And once the player has made it through all of that, it's time for them to finally enter the Golden Temple. Despite what you may have been led to believe, the first interior section is one of the easiest parts of this level, although it does require a fair bit of patience and can leave the player with low health for the sections where they really need it. The first room of the interior opens with a bat, an enemy that first appeared in the second level of Holy Diver. Bats swoop from side to side and fire 3 projectiles out in a fan arrangement. Bats themselves are fairly easy enemies to deal with, and the player can simply jump and shoot them from the side if they're low enough, or stay between their shots and jump when they swoop if they're too high to be killed from the side. Continuing on through this room, the player has to once again deal with boulders. The ones here can be a bit of a nuisance, as if they're allowed to stall the player for even just one cycle, it can become quite difficult to progress forward without taking significant damage. This becomes especially apparent with the presence of larvae in the following column, which, as we've learned as of this point, can get quite out of hand if not dealt with immediately. All of this in tandem essentially requires the player to march forward onto the column with no hesitation. Not necessarily that difficult a feat, but can still be troublesome if the player leaps too far forward onto the column. The final noteworthy obstacle in this room is the boulder pattern following the column. This one can be quite hard to avoid, as unless the player takes extreme caution to manipulate the spawn of the boulders, they will be placed in a situation that requires some precise inputs to dodge the simultaneous attack. Upon ascending the stairs into the second room of this area, the player is faced with a new enemy, the stone head. Stone heads repeatedly jump up and down at one of two heights depending on the player's relative position to them, whilst firing two projectiles at random points within their jump cycle. If the player is approximately at or below the Y position of the stone head, it will jump to the low position, but if the player is significantly above the Y position of the stone head, it will jump to the high position. If the stone head remains in the low cycle, it will retain its pattern and always fire projectiles at the same 2 points in its jump. However, if the stone head is brought into the high cycle, it will begin to randomize its pattern and fire projectiles at 2 random points in its jump until re-entering the low cycle. This can be both a blessing and a curse when dealing with the stone heads, as on one hand, it allows for the player to manipulate the enemy into having a favorable cycle, but on the other hand, it makes dealing with stone heads placed on the far side of a raised column or platform quite a tedious experience that can leave the player with fairly low health. The first of the stone heads benefits the player from its randomized pattern, as they can simply keep going up and down the stairs until a favorable one emerges, after which simply spamming the B button does the trick. The bat here can be difficult to kill given its distance from the player, and it requires decently precise timing to actually hit. It's technically a skippable enemy, however choosing not to take care of it before moving on to the next section can backfire, as it prevents the player from being able to safely destroy all of the breakable blocks in this section, which both have a chance of dropping health or mana from the player, and clears out a space to deal with the next few enemies. This becomes significant when we take a look at what actually lies beyond this point. Not only are the Stonehead and Bat alone highly synergistic in this configuration, but the placement of the column essentially multiplies the effectiveness of the Stonehead, forcing the player to fight it in the high cycle and making it extremely difficult to get into a position where damaging either the Bat or Stonehead is possible, and let alone being able to stay there long enough to kill either of them. Even with a fairly good pattern here, it's likely you'll end up losing half of your health or more. In fact, it's entirely possible that the Stonehead just won't relent and prevents you from even getting up onto the column at all. Once past that, however, the game actually decides to be generous for once, as the next Stonehead is similar to the first, where you can manipulate its pattern by repeatedly loading the room. And not only that, but defeating it grants you with a life potion, bringing you back to full health. Now, something you'll learn across your playthrough of Holy Diver is that, whenever it seems that the game is being benevolent with life refills, it generally means that something dreadful is around the corner. Case in point, ascending the column in front of the player reveals not only one, but 2 Stoneheads that must be faced in the high cycle. That's 2 randomized flurries of projectiles barreling towards the player, leaving almost no room to stand at any one time. These Stoneheads serve to give the player a serious beating and pretty much nullify the effects of the life potion received from the previous one, often leaving the player with half health if they're lucky. Not a good position to be in going into the rest of the stage, as we'll soon find out. There are boulders in this room as well, but they're not all that notable and really only serve to hasten the player's journey forward. Now make sure to grab the mana pickup and catch your breath. It only gets worse from here. Leading up to this point, we've dealt with countless obstacles, crossed precarious terrain where death waits at a moment's notice, and ascended the fated Golden Temple, making our way through erratic storms of projectiles in the process. By this point, the game over screen is all but burned into the TV screen, but we're here, the top of the Golden Temple. I hope you've enjoyed the prelude. The second half of the level starts off with a long stretch of platforming with very limited ground to stand on. That on its own would be plenty hard enough for other games, but not Holy Diver. Joining the fun this time is a new enemy perfectly designed to ruin your time, the Fire Snake. The Fire Snake is essentially a much worse version of the Sun enemy from Super Mario Bros. 3. It erratically moves around the screen in a number of random patterns, looping around itself as to block as much room as possible, and charging towards the player at any point in one of several possible configurations. With any hit it lands, sending the player straight into oblivion. And even on the off chance the player lands on one of the few instances of solid ground, they'll find themselves with their health reduced by nearly a third, as the Fire Snake deals the most damage of any enemy thus far in the game. As an obstacle for such a platforming section, the Fire Snake is extremely effective. Its presence single-handedly makes this screen the most difficult in the level so far, yet even so, the remaining screens dwarf even this one's difficulty. But before we can get to those, we first need to do a little side quest. You see, throughout Holy Diver there are certain items to be collected that are either needed for or aid in progression. Thus far in the game, the bracelet and jump boots have been collected, allowing the player to break blocks and jump higher respectively. The item present in the 4th stage is the Wizard's Staff, which cuts the player's MP usage in half. It's technically an optional item, however, from this point on in the game, magic becomes even more useful, and thus going on without the staff will only make everything much harder. The staff itself isn't all that hard to obtain, and the only enemies between it and the player from this point are 2 bats and 2 gargoyles. The first of these enemies are pretty simple, as the bat can be shot from the side, and the gargoyle likes to just wander off the screen and leave. The second pair, however, can be a little tricky, since the bat is in a position where lining up to hit it without being hit yourself has very little time for error, and the gargoyle too is in such a position. Both require fairly precise timing and inputs, and can chip some health away from the player if they're not careful, something that at this point in the level is a vital resource, especially given what's to be found upon entering the next screen. That being the single hardest instance of the single hardest non-boss enemy in the game, the Golem. The Golem's attack pattern consists of marching forward towards the player and firing 2 projectiles at a regular interval that converge on the player, dealing a half a bar of damage. Additionally, if the player stays in the same Y position as the Golem for an extended period of time, the Golem begins firing an additional 2 projectiles that spin around each other and travel faster than the other projectiles, dealing a full bar of damage. If that weren't enough as is, ever making contact with the Golem itself deals 3.5 bars of damage to the player. That's more than 2/3 of the maximum health at this point in the game. Not to mention, the Golem itself has just as much, if not more health than any of the 3 previous bosses in the game. Golems are an absolutely brutal enemy, and this one in particular is more so than any other given the terrain on which it is placed. Staying back on the first platform simply allows the Golem to stunlock the player in the hallway while pouring obscene amounts of damage into them, and prevents the player from getting much damage off on the Golem. But attempting to get in close on the second platform and deal heavy damage places the player in a prime position to be knocked into the abyss and runs the risk of running into the Golem and losing nearly all of their health. There really is no safe way to deal with this behemoth of an enemy. At any time it can fire 2 well-timed shots and send the player straight into a pit, or simply not give the player enough time to get their own attacks in before it falls into a pit itself, forcing the player to restart the fight by leaving the room and coming back. Did I mention that this Golem drops a power-up that's required to go to the next part of the stage? Yeah. By the time you finally beat this guy, you'll be so fed up with this game that going on just doesn't seem worth it anymore. That is, if you haven't already ripped the game out of the console in a fit of rage and destroyed it with a hammer by then. But, yay, you beat it. Now you can turn into a dragon. Woohoo! Anyways, the flying section isn't too noteworthy itself. There is a new enemy present known as Sparks, which come in packs and fly across the screen in a swooping pattern, but these can be easily avoided by simply staying at the top of the screen. The Fire Snake also makes a return here, but it's much less of a threat given that it can't knock the player into a pit or anything. Although if the player isn't careful, it's fairly easy to die here, especially coming off of the Golem fight where the player is likely to be on low health. There is an extra life on this screen, but it's likely to go unnoticed, as there are such a number of enemy sprites on screen that the game begins to experience sprite overflow, which you can see affecting the health and mana interface when the player nears the top of the screen. And funnily enough, when this happens, the game decides to delete the extra life pickup entity to save space because of course it does. This problem can be averted by killing the fire snake and staying away from the top of the screen afterwards, which is, for the most part, an optimal thing to do anyways, since the snake drops a life potion when killed, although certain patterns can make it quite difficult to hit and may end up allowing for the fire snake to kill the player instead in a twist of fate, sending them back to the beginning of the screen and forcing them to fight the golem again. That may sound horrendous, but as you'll soon find out, the possibility of having another attempt at the boss when the time arrives is too tantalizing a prospect to pass up so easily. Once the player reaches the platform at the end of the flying section, they must simply return to human form and prepare to face 3 more golems. Moving into the final section of the level, there are 2 types of enemies left to worry about: the sparks from the flying section and golems. If allowed to roam freely, the sparks can prove to be quite a nuisance and serve as a sort of ambient field of damage that moves across the screen. Luckily for everyone who has played or ever will play this game, the sparks can be frozen with the blizzard spell, taking the edge off of what would otherwise be some of the hardest rooms in the game. That just leaves the golems. Unlike the last one that synergized perfectly with its terrain and whose defeat was required to continue, the next 2 golems actually are made significantly easier by their environment and can be skipped. As long as the player keeps Blizzard active while waiting for the first golem to approach it and times their jumps to avoid the projectiles of the second one, this room can be cleared relatively easy without taking much damage, if any at all. Furthermore, there's a pickup that increases the player's max health by 1 bar and refills it at the same time, directly in the line of your path. But remember what I said earlier about situations like this one? Something you'll learn across your playthrough of Holy Diver is that whenever it seems that the game is being benevolent with life refills, it generally means that something dreadful is around the corner. Prepare yourself. But first, we have one last room to clear. The final room is pretty similar to the last one in that you're faced with randomly spawning spark enemies and a golem. The blizzard spell can once again be employed here to make things easier, however the golem fight is a bit more involved. I believe it is possible to skip this one, but the timing and room to do so makes it much harder than the last 2. In addition to that, it drops a mana pickup that's quite invaluable at this point, given the need to spam Blizzard and the sheer necessity of magic for the boss fight, so defeating this golem is generally favorable. Compared to the first one, it's much easier given there isn't a pit to fall into, and the ceiling is high enough to dodge the projectiles for the most part. However, the player can still take a fair bit of damage here when the golem gets in close, which is very difficult to prevent as they can tank a tremendous amount of damage before falling. However, once the golem has fallen, the player must simply cross a brief, albeit extremely nerve-wracking parkour section, where Blizzard is an absolute must due to the sparks. And upon doing so, they arrive at the final door in the stage. All that's left is to summon your courage and enter. I want you to take a second to think about the hardest boss you've beaten across every game you've ever played. For some of you, it might have been a classic retro boss, like Mike Tyson from Punch-Out, Dracula from Castlevania, or something like the Yellow Devil from Mega Man. For others, perhaps a Soulsborne type boss, like Melania from Elden Ring, the Nameless King from Dark Souls 3, or even Spawn of Ogdo on Jedi Survivor's hardest difficulty. Nevertheless, it was a challenge, but you overcame it. How? You learned the patterns, got used to the rhythm, and perfected your inputs. Once you managed to do everything right without messing up, that was it. You had done it, victory was yours. Now, I want you to imagine that the boss you thought of had no patterns, that its attacks were randomly timed without consideration of how fast you could realistically be expected to avoid them. That, no matter how perfect your inputs, if the boss wanted you dead, then no matter where you were, no matter how well you reacted, it could simply end your run without warning. I want you to imagine a boss fight where you are not in control. On the surface, Holy Diver's eye column seems to be a pretty simple, and even easy boss fight. The boss itself consists of 3 segments, each with a weak spot and 2 cannons that shoot projectiles at the player. There are 4 platforms present for the player to stand on in the boss room. However, only the one on the left side of the screen is reasonably accessible. Both the platforms and the boss move up and down continuously throughout the fight, and they do so at different speeds. The 3 segments of the boss all spin constantly during the fight, only being damageable when their weak spot is visible and firing a projectile periodically from one of their cannons. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? Well, here's the catch. The 3 segments of the boss are all placed at a random point in the rotation when the fight begins, causing the firing pattern of the boss to be completely unpredictable. That, combined with the player's location and the boss's never retaining the same alignment due to its movement differing from the platforms, makes memorizing the eye column's pattern an impossible thing to do. Thus, the player relies solely on reacting to the projectiles as they appear. But even that is not a certainty. If you recall earlier in this video when I was covering the section that utilized the dragon power-up, there was a glitch that caused visual bugs and the deletion of an extra life pickup. Well, there's a similar problem during this boss fight in which the texture of some projectiles fails to appear, rendering them invisible, whilst their hit detection remains intact, meaning the player can be sent off of their platform and into oblivion without any warning whatsoever. And speaking of such, if the player is not positioned directly on the far right side of the platform, then one hit is all it takes to be immediately killed. The same is true if the player is ever hit whilst airborne, even if only a few pixels off the ground. Thus, if the eye column decides to fire a second shot after you have just been hit away from the right edge of the platform already, or after you have already jumped to avoid its previous projectile, then there is essentially nothing you can do to avoid dying. And that's all if you've gotten to the point where you can near instantly react to each of the boss's projectiles as they spawn, and dodge the reasonably avoidable ones, which in of itself is a severely difficult thing to do. The eye column serves as a sadistic end to an already harrowing level. Ultimately, it drains your lives one by one, slowly lowering you to a single life, before snuffing out even that last precious life you struggled so hard to bring this far, sending you back to the beginning to drag yourself across broken glass back to its doorstep, only to suffer the same fate. Game over after game over, as time begins to blur and you find yourself trapped in a never-ending loop of infernal suffering. Like Sisyphus, you roll your boulder to the top of this 8-bit mountain, only for the eye column to push it back to the bottom just as the summit comes in. If you made it this far in the video, I'd like to say thank you for watching. If you liked what you saw and want to support the channel to help make videos like this one possible, a subscription would go a long way. And lastly, I highly recommend checking out Holy Diver if you haven't already. My words can only do its difficulty so much justice, and experiencing it yourself is the only way to truly understand why I consider the Golden Temple to be the hardest level and the hardest game. Thanks for watching.